In this last video of the section, we're going to do two more examples of solving a quadratic by completing the square, and then we'll learn the third method for solving a quadratic equation. So, let's solve this quadratic equation by completing the square. Remember, leading coefficient must be a 1. In this case, we have a 2. So I'm going to have to divide each of the terms by 2, which will give us x squared minus 7 over 2x plus 3 over 2 is equal to 0. So it's an equivalent equation. I just divided everything by 2. So here's where I would determine what a, b, and c are. My a is a 1. I'll just make a note of that. A equals 1. B equals negative 7 halves. C equals 3 halves. All right, so let's take the negative 3 and get rid of it on this side. So subtract from both sides 3 halves. So that's going to give me x squared minus 7 over 2x equals, and I leave some space here because I'm going to have to add a number here, negative 3 over 2. So all we have done is subtracted this from both sides. Now I need to go and compute that magic number, which is 1/2 b squared. That's what I'm going to add to both sides. Let me use a different color here. I'm going to add the same thing to both sides. Well, b happens to be negative 7 over 2. And since we're going to square it, I don't need to worry about the negative sign. So this is going to be equal to 1/2 7 over 2 squared, which is 7 over 4 squared, which is 49 over 16. So I'm going to add this number, which is 7 over 4 squared, to both sides. So 49 over 16 plus 49 over 16. Okay, great. Now this is a perfect square, the left-hand side. And it's very simple. It doesn't take too much work to figure out what it is, to factor it. We're basically going to take the number that we squared to get this one. What's the square root of this? It'd be 7 over 4. That's the number, in fact. 7 over 4 squared gave us 49 over 6. So if we want the positive square root of that, we're just going to take 7 over 4. Because this is a minus, this is going to be a minus. And let's see, what is this equal to? I want to combine these two fractions together. Let's get a common denominator of 16. So I would need to multiply top and bottom here by 8. So it would be negative 24 over 16 plus 49 over 16. All I did is change negative 3 over 2 into negative 24 over 16 by multiplying by 8 over 8. And that gives us this common denominator of 16. What is 49 and negative 24? 49 minus 24 is 25 over 16. So this is 25 over 16. And as fractions go, that's a nice fraction for us because it's a perfect square fraction. The next thing we're going to have to do is use the square root property. Square root property to get x minus 7 over 4 equals plus or minus big square root 25 over 16. So now we just have a little bit of simplifying to do. And I think since I might be running out of room, I'm going to have to go up a little bit. Let me underline that. Okay, I'm going to add 7 over 4 to both sides to get x by itself. And I'm going to, let me just go ahead and write that. X equals 7 over 4 plus or minus. And I can write this like, when you have a fraction underneath a radical, you can write them with separate radicals. Just like that. And this is a nice perfect square fraction we had, so it's going to be 5 over 4. So this is 7 over 4 plus or minus 5 over 4. And I'll write the final answer by simplifying this. Let's do the minus first. 7 over 4 minus 5 over 4 is 2 over 4. Well, that's 1/2. And then when we add, we get 7 over 4 plus 5 over 4. 7 plus 5 is 12. 12 over 4. Well, that's equal to 3. These are the two solutions to this quadratic equation, and we obtained it by completing the square. Okay, let's do one more completing the square problem, and I wrote the solution down here just to make sure I get it right. All right, we're going to complete the square, but once again, our coefficient of the x squared term is not a 1. So we need to divide by that coefficient. And we get x squared minus 6 over 9x. Minus 6 over 9. That's the same as minus 2 over 3 if I reduce. Minus 2 over 3x minus 4 over 9 equals 0. So these two equations are equivalent, and now we have a coefficient of 1 for the x squared, which is what we wanted. So basically we have a equals 1, b equals negative 2/3, and c is equal to negative 4/9. So I can go ahead, I know I'm going to need to compute my magic number, 1/2 b squared, at some point, so I'll go ahead and do it right now. That's 1/2. And it's negative, but I'm going to square it so it doesn't matter. I don't need to worry about the negative sign. Well, what do you get when you multiply 1 over 2 times 2 over 3? Those 2's cross cancel. And you get 1 over 3 squared. 1 over 3 times 1 over 3 is 1 over 9. So that is going to be my magic number that I'm going to add to both sides. But first, we do what we did in the previous problems. I need to get rid of that first. Add 4/9 to both sides. So I get x squared minus 2 over 3x, leave some space, equals 4 over 9. All I have done from here to there is add 4/9 to both sides. And now, what do I do to complete the square? I add the same number to both sides. It's the number that would complete the square here. It's this, 1 over 9. 1 over 9. 1 over 9. And now this left-hand side is a perfect square. Doesn't look very nice, but it's going to be in parentheses x, leave some space, something squared equals 4 over 9 plus 1 over 9 is 5 over 9. And what number goes here? Is it positive or negative? Well, it's negative because this is negative. This one is negative. And what do we put here? The square root of this. It was what we had in parentheses here. That was 1/3 squared equals 1 over 9. We put the 1/3 right there. If you square 1/3, you get 1/3 times 1/3, which is 1/9. And if we FOIL this out, we can see that we would get exactly this. Let's talk through that. Well, we certainly get, if we had x minus 1/3, x minus 1/3, we'd get x squared for the first. For the inner and outer, we would get negative 1/3 x twice. So negative 1/3 x and another negative 1/3 x gives us negative 2/3 x. And then you multiply this, the last, times the last, negative 1/3 gives us positive 1/9. All right, so now we go to the square root property to solve this. And maybe I'll go up just a little bit. X minus 1/3 is equal to 5/9 under a radical, and it's plus or minus. So that means X is equal to, add 1/3 to both sides, radical 5 over radical 9. I wrote this fraction under the radical as radical of the top numerator over the radical of the denominator. And this is simply equal to, radical 9 is simply equal to 3, so we have a common denominator. So this means that X is equal to 1/3 plus or minus radical 5 over 3. I'm going to go ahead and leave it that way. I like it that way. I could have, since they had the same denominator, I could have written it as 1 plus or minus radical 5 all over 3. But I think I prefer this way. So that's a solution by completing the square. Okay, we have one more method for solving a quadratic, and probably the one you're already very familiar with, and we'll do about 2 examples. The quadratic formula. Whenever you have a quadratic, you get it written in the standard form, ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. The solution would then be this fraction, negative b plus or minus, big radical, b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. That's it. All you need to do is note what a, b, and c are, and then you can get rid of the equation and just plug it in right here. So it's pretty straightforward. All right, let's do this with a number 11. Let's do this example. So what I need to note is that a is equal to 3, b is equal to negative 2, and c is equal to 4. Now that I know that, I could just erase this equation. I don't need to ever look at it again now that I know what a, b, and c are. So the solution is negative b. Since b is negative 2, put another negative sign in front of it. The opposite of negative 2 is positive 2. Plus or minus, big radical. B squared is negative 2, quantity squared. Make sure you put the parentheses around negative 2 when you square it. Minus 4ac. A is a 3 and and c is a 4. So 4ac all over 2 times a. That is the solution, but it's not acceptable as a final answer. We need to simplify this. And I'm going to show you the way I like to simplify this. I always do it this way. I break this into 2 fractions and just deal with them individually. So all I'm going to do is something like this. Let's say we have u plus v over w. All I'm going to do is use the fact that that's equal to u over w plus v over w. Just a simple rule of fractions, of adding fractions. So I have 2 over, this is a 6, right? 2 over 6 plus or minus this radical over 6. And what do we have underneath the radical? Negative 2 squared is 4. Minus, and what do we get when we multiply these 3 numbers together? 4 times 3 is 12. 12 times 4 is 48. All right, let's keep simplifying. Let's see, I'll go to the right, so I don't, just to make sure I don't run out of room. 1 over 3, that's this part right here, plus or minus, and what is under the radical? Negative 44. Well, now we know how to deal with this, because we talked about complex numbers in a previous section. So let's see how I deal with that. 1/3 plus or minus I radical 44 over 6. Remember that? You take the negative sign out when you have a negative number under a radical, and you put I in front. Radical 44, let me do some scratch work over here. Radical 44 is equal to radical 4 times radical 11. I broke it up that way because I know radical 4 is a perfect square, and that's equal to 2 radical 11. So I'm going to get 1/3 plus or minus 2 radical 11 over 6 times I. One more thing and we're done. So the final answer, that 2 and the 3, the 2 over 6 can cancel. So I'm going to say that x is equal to 1/3 plus or minus radical 11 over 3 times I. And let's make sure, yep, that's exactly what we expected. And the I, you can write it on either side. Frequently when there's a fraction, you might put I in front, or if there's a radical, you'll put it in front, but you can also put it in this way as well. Whichever way is easier to read for me. Okay, one more and we're done with this section. Use the quadratic formula to solve this quadratic. In this case, we have a equal to 1 coefficient, b is a negative 2, c is equal to 2. That tells us that x is equal to negative b, which is a 2, plus or minus a big radical. B squared would be a 4. Negative 2 squared is 4. Minus 4ac. 4, 1, 2. That's 4ac. All over 2a, and 2 times a is just a 2. 2 times 1 is 2. So moving to the right, I'm going to get 2 over 2 plus or minus the big radical over 2. And let's see, what is underneath that radical? 4 minus 4 times 1 times 2 is 8. 4 minus 8 is negative 4. So simplifying gives us 1. 2 over 2 is 1. Plus or minus, and let's see, if I pull out the negative, I put an I out front, and radical 4 is just the number 2. So let me do that in 2 steps. I radical 4 over 2, and that's going to give us 1 plus or minus 2i over 2, because radical 4 is just 2. 2 over 2 is 1, so the 2 over 2 will cancel. And what do we get? 1 plus or minus I. That is what x is equal to. So that's 2 numbers, 1 plus I and 1 minus I. And those 2 complex numbers are the only 2 numbers that you could plug in for x that would make this a true statement. And that's the quadratic formula.